in many ways, the biggest advances come from applying often quite simple, quite cheap technology at scale. And a lot of my work as a funder and an investor in Nesta is we finance companies and social enterprises using technology to improve ambulance services or farming in Nepal or urban transport in Africa, that sort of thing. So that's meat and drink to me. I think, though, however, you do have to combine the technological, and the social. And here, actually, I think East Asia is in some ways in the forefront. So if you ask which city on the planet probably has the most advanced ideas for combining high technology with social innovation, it'd be Seoul in Korea, where the mayor, Wonsoon Park, has been an advocate of social innovation for many years, and it's also probably got the most connected population on the planet. Taiwan is another fascinating example where the national government, thanks to ministers like Audrey Tang, has integrated social innovation into how they make policy, using digital platforms to involve the public in shaping policy far ahead of anything in Europe, let alone North America. And of course, right across China, you've got extraordinary experiments underway on things like driverless cars, city brains, and so on. Sometimes a bit detached from the social input, but sometimes with a sense of how you need to engage civil society and citizens to get those technologies to work. So I actually think that in the next decade, this region will probably be looked to as a pioneer, a source of the innovations for the future, more perhaps than the old countries of Europe and the US.
The examples that you mentioned are, by and large, urban situations and in the slightly more developed countries. What about the agricultural and the rural communities of Asia? How does tech fit into their lifestyle?
Well, there's a very interesting story you can look at in sub-Saharan Africa, which in some ways I know the rural side of that more than Asia. It's a lot poorer than Asia. But there, the spread of simple phones and smartphones has massively transformed the everyday life of farmers. Now, in some cases, that is simply making sure that data on weather patterns, impending droughts or floods and so on is communicated to farmers. Sometimes it's things like turning them into a collective intelligence. So the We Farm project is one I really like in Africa, which has about 3 million farmers now using an SMS system to post problems they're facing. Then using a bit of smart AI, that problem is sent to other farmers who might have solutions. You then get a response from the collective brain of those 2 or 3 million farmers and hopefully can solve your problem. We've worked a lot on aquaculture issues, both in Asia and Africa, where, again, quite simple technologies can help link the aqua farmers to intermediate markets, to end markets, so they understand the price they can get for their fish. They can reduce delays in the transport system so they don't have so much wastage. A modern smart farming system is so data intensive, and most of the technologies are inherently quite cheap, that I think we will see a complete transformation of everyday life in farming over the next 10 or 20 years if governments, funders, and others put in place the right access.
How does that access happen, though? I mean, you talked about the collective brain, and that's a really intriguing theoretical notion, because we do have the technology, we do have the expertise, we do have the talent, but it's all very dissipated. None of it really organizes in that way. How can we create a situation in Asia where those capabilities and that knowledge and that talent is able to collectively act in order to make difference?
So I think this is the key question of the next 10 years, and a lot of my work at the moment is on collective intelligence and how do you organize collective intelligence in practice. And we're working with many parts of the UNDP across the world in making that practical. And it requires a curator, an orchestrator of that knowledge. So I mentioned We Farm. That only works because someone manages the platform, puts it in place, makes it easy to use. The Vampire system in Southeast Asia across Indonesia does a very similar job for climate shifts. But again, it requires someone to pull together all the data, some of it from satellites and sensors, some of it generated by citizens. That has to be orchestrated and then made useful and available to others. Healthcare is the other field where there are huge numbers of innovations around the world pooling patient knowledge and patient experience, as well as doctors and nurses' knowledge and experience, so that that collective knowledge can easily be accessed by someone in a village facing a particular problem, having to make a diagnosis for something they haven't seen before. But what we're lacking are the people who are really good at that job of curating and organizing knowledge. And one of my predictions is that if we were inventing the United Nations now, we probably wouldn't be creating a whole series of money-based organizations, an IMF, a World Bank, ADB, IADB, and so on. Or rather, we would still be creating them, but alongside them we'd be creating as important organizations whose job was the organization of data, information, and knowledge at scale and in a systematic way. At the moment, it's no one's job to do that well, so it's not done well, it's done as an afterthought, but it seems to me so obvious that at this point in the 21st century, that's the crucial bit to make systems work.
Are you seeing anybody who's managing to do that effectively yet? And if not, what is the big hold-up? How can we actually get all those players together, all those stakeholders, and have those conversations in a meaningful way?
Well, some of this work is done really rather well within some corporates. So within an Alibaba, a Samsung, a Google, they invest very heavily in training and skills and the systematic orchestration of their own data, their own information, their own knowledge, because that's key to being successful as a business. What we're missing is an equivalent seriousness of purpose for public interest or for very distributed systems like farming or retail, etc. We're beginning to see some good alternatives. So the science world now has lots of citizen science projects, often with millions of members of the public playing a part in spotting new stars or tracking penguins in the Antarctic and so on. We're seeing a lot happening in health, again, because there's a lot of investment in health and a lot of motivation amongst patients and doctors. But I think we are missing the core institutions who see it as their job to do this, and then the flow of both expertise and money from the big investment organizations, and probably a lot of the expertise needs to come from the private sector, which just has more experience of doing this well.
So give me some examples, or give me your top 3 ideas about what Asia could do. What are the technologies out there that are applicable and yet are not yet gaining traction in this part of the world?
Well, a very simple example, and one I'm working on a bit, is labor markets and jobs. So in the next 10 or 15 years, we will see, partly because of technology, huge disruption to all sorts of industries like textiles, low-level manufacturing, which employ millions of people across Asia. Now, what we could do, and what some countries are trying to do, is to pull together all the available data on jobs, what skills are being looked for, what pay levels are, and curating that as a collective intelligence, turning that into tools so individuals can know if their job is likely to be destroyed in the next few years, can know what one extra skill would make them most likely to have a job in 10 years' time, can point them towards the training provider who can help them with that skill. Now, that is doable with today's technologies. It requires quite a bit of orchestration and curation, but it's absolutely vital for countries like Bangladesh or Thailand or Malaysia if people are not going to face horrendous disruption to their lives in the next few years. So that's one territory where there are maturing technologies.
And again, I mean, you're talking here about fairly large scale and government involved kind of projects.
That almost certainly has to have government involved, both at a national level and at a city level as well.
Are there private sector technologies that are perhaps a little bit easier to implement, that don't take so much political power and convening capacity to put together?
Well, in those examples, they need to be private partners, like Google, LinkedIn, and others who have very sophisticated technologies. And we're working on similar projects in Europe with Google and others as partners, because often they have more advanced skills, but the full benefit to the public will only come if these are turned into public goods of some kind. I think the same applies in agriculture, where there's lots of proprietary knowledge, there's lots of private offerings, but in the medium term, I would hope that almost any government should be providing all its farmers with access as a public good to the best available data on what is happening, to trends in weather and climate and soils and so on, and then let the market create apps off the back of that data, which can be tailored to different uses. But the underlying provision should be done as a commons, as a public good.